How do we get people to listen to and understand science? These were the kinds of questions that we kept falling back to during our discussions in the Science Forward class. And I think it's because there's been a lot of public mistrust around science recently, right? Whether it's due to COVID and vaccines or climate change, especially the way that the current administration has been treating these issues, but also because these issues are scary and people don't know what to believe. So, how do we start building this kind of trust in science again? How do we get people to start listening to these numbers, listening to scientists, so that we can actually start creating change instead of sitting here and debating whether these issues even exist in the first place? For me, I started thinking, what makes me trust in science? And I thought, okay, maybe it comes down to education, right? Um, I'm an engineering major. Maybe I gravitate more towards science and math, STEM classes. Maybe I take more of those kinds of classes. Maybe I'm more interested in that. And the more that I thought about it, the less it boiled down to specific classes that I took. And the more it became about the science senses, right? Those science senses that we've been talking about throughout this class, the number sense, data sense, knowledge sense. I feel like I have pretty strong science senses. And that's what enables me to trust in science because I can look at a fact or a statistic. I can see, okay, does this come from a reliable source? Does this make sense? Do these numbers make sense? How does this fit in with my existing science knowledge? And how can I kind of synthesize that? Because I have strong science senses, that allows me to trust in science because I can figure out more accurately which science is trustable in the first place. So, how do we start to strengthen these science senses in the public, whether it's in the classroom, but especially beyond the classroom when people are no longer in education? How do we get people to strengthen their science senses so that we can start getting a more public trust in science again? In a way, I think that this class is part of the answer. I know it is a Macaulay Honors specific class, right? Not everyone in the world is going to be taking it, but the kind of discussions that we had in this class, I feel like were discussions that you could have beyond the classroom, right? We had a lot of open-ended discussions. They were guided discussions maybe around a specific topic, right? Like AI or energy or climate change, but they were very open-ended, and a lot of it became about what have you heard about this topic? What do you already know about this topic? And what do you think about this topic? And I feel like these are the kind of discussions that you could have at your kitchen table or with a friend or with a colleague. They don't necessarily have to be restricted to inside the classroom. And if we can get people to start talking about science in the kinds of ways that we did in these discussions in class, I feel like we can get people thinking about science, strengthening their science senses without even really feeling like they're being overly like educational or something like that. Right? We're not throwing facts at them. We're not throwing like a test at them to take. Here, this is how you study your science senses. But it is the kind of thing that happens more naturally with discussion as we get people to start thinking and talking about these things. Right? And it could be as simple as saying, hey, I read this article. Why don't you check it out and tell me what you think? I read this scientific paper, maybe not a super long or complicated scientific paper, but something digestible, something that's more easily shareable. But hey, I read this paper. Can you read it and tell me what you think? Let's talk about it. Or even be like more simpler than that. I heard this on the news. What do you think about like AI? What do you think about climate change? What are your worries? What are your fears? Where are you coming from? And kind of making this empathetic connection with people before you start talking about the science. I think it makes people much more open to listening and to thinking about these things rather than shutting down once they see numbers or shutting down once they see things that don't align with their worldview, right? You make that kind of human connection first before you start talking about science and try to find a common ground. I'm reminded of one of these excerpts from the readings that we did in class. This is from Physics for Future Presidents by Richard A. Muller. And in it, he's like recalling that one of his students was able to defend the efficiency of solar power to a physicist who had like brushed it off. And he writes, she remembered the important numbers because she had found them fascinating and important. She had not just memorized them, but had thought about them and discussed them with her classmates. They had become part of her, a part she could bring out and use when needed, even a year later. That's the end of the quote. But yeah, that concept of the science becoming a part of you because you had talked about it, because you had thought that it was interesting and important. I think that's part of the power of discussion, right? If you start connecting, okay, this is what's relevant to me, this is what's interesting, this is what the people around me are talking about. As you start building these kinds of conversations, these kind of discussions, your science senses naturally start growing because you're talking about it, because you're engaging with science, even if it doesn't feel like it's in like a science class, right? I've been rambling for too much, but my point is talk about science, start connecting with people about science and on science, and make that science a part of you. And I think that's really the start. Thank you.